This is the next, I believe it's the fifth in our series on what I consider to be the 10 most important stories in the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And we spent a little bit more time on the Abraham set of stories, Abraham and Sarah set of stories than I had planned on, but I'm no apologies there because it is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of Christianity to see our roots in the covenant with Abraham and Sarah. We followed that family as it grew into a nation, as God had promised from the beginning. And because of a number of circumstances, that nation became not refugees, sorry, became welcomed visitors in Egypt. And that's the story of Joseph. We're not going to rehash it. I go back to the YouTube from last week to get the details on that. But by the time the book of Genesis ends, Joseph and the whole nation, what's now a nation of Israelites, is well ensconced in a very, very good part of Egypt, and and everything looks very, very good for them, except that they continue to have this notion that God promised them the land that the promised land, the land that that their ancestors Abraham and Sarah sojourned in. Sojourn, basically means camped out in. They lived a nomadic lifestyle in that land, but they never owned it. So now the Israelites are in Egypt. Genesis ends with, in just a couple of chapters, Jacob dies. Jacob's name has been changed to Israel. So from now on, we confusingly go back and forth between Jacob and Israel. And it gets more complicated a little bit later. Jacob has died. Joseph gets permission from the Pharaoh to take Jacob's mummy. They talk about 40 days of embalming of Jacob's body, and they take it back up to Canaan to that burial plot that Abraham had bought 3 generations back, probably more than that at this point, that he had bought for Sarah, and then others of the patriarchs and matriarchs were also buried there. They go up there, they bury Jacob, they come down. The brothers are afraid that now that Jacob's dead, Joseph will finally get retribution on them for their treachery. And Joseph assures them that all is forgiven. And then Joseph makes his kin, the people of Israel, makes them promise that after he dies and is embalmed, he says, I believe that sometime God is going to take you to that land that he promised to our ancestors. And when he does, don't forget to take my mummy with you and bury it in that same burial plot. So it's a wonderful, poignant story at the very end of the book of Genesis. Last week we talked about the book of Exodus. starts with a pharaoh rose on the throne who did not know Joseph. And there's a couple 100-year gap between Genesis and Exodus. And we do know of a change in dynasty in that same general period in Egyptian history. A foreign dynasty took over Egypt. And that's the beginning of the setting for the book of Exodus. The new Pharaoh, the new regime, has no interest in the Israelites, other than very early on, the Pharaoh and his court see that that's free labor, potentially free labor. And so rather than, over the course of a very short time, rather than there being honored guests in Egypt, they are indentured and then essentially enslaved in Egypt. Even with that, the Hebrews, as they're also called, or the Israelites, continue to thrive and to grow as a people. And so the Pharaoh is concerned about that and orders that all the male babies born to Hebrew women should be executed. One family defies that order, and I can't remember the woman's name, but her two existing children, Aaron and Miriam, conspire with her to hide their baby brother when he's born, and they put him in. The mother makes a basket, covers it basically with tar so that it's waterproof, and puts the baby out in the Nile River after feeding it, puts it out in the Nile River every day until it's nighttime, and then Miriam goes out, retrieves the baby, brings it back to be nursed and to kept overnight, and then they go through this routine again. One of the times when the baby is out there in the bulrushes, the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter, comes down to the Nile to take a bath with her attendants. She discovers this basket and the beautiful baby in it, and she decides to adopt the baby. And she takes it home. She calls it Moses, which is not a Hebrew word, it's an Egyptian word that means drawn out of the water. Isn't it interesting that one of, if not the greatest Hebrew or Israelite or Jewish hero has an Egyptian name? In any case, Moses is raised in the court of Pharaoh as essentially a nephew of Pharaoh. His adopted mother is the Pharaoh's sister. And everything is wonderful. Moses thrives in the court, and at some point, it's not exactly clear in the story how this happens. There's one little twist that's a fun aside, and that is when the princess draws the baby out of the water and says, "Oh, I'm going to adopt it. I'm going to adopt it and make it my own child." Well, she wasn't nursing, so she needed to find a nurse for her newly adopted child. And Miriam just happens to be in the neighborhood and says to the princess, "I know a woman who can nurse your child." And they work it out for months that Miriam goes to the palace gets Moses, takes him back to his mother, who nurses him, and then it brings him back to the palace. There's just, I love that drama, and I continue to insist that it's comedy in there, not like laughing in the aisles, but just the irony
Uh-huh.
of these things about our major religious figures. Excuse me. So Moses becomes an adult. The Israelites are increasingly burdened with the slavery that they're experiencing, or the under the Egyptians. And one time Moses, and again, we don't know, we're not told how Moses knew himself to be a Hebrew. I guess the assumption is all of those times he spent with his mother in among the Hebrews gave him the understanding that that's where he came from. In any case, one time he's out like in a chariot, and as a royal, royal guy, and he sees an Egyptian overseer mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. And Moses gets really angry, gets off his chariot, goes over and literally kills the Egyptian, murders the Egyptian to save the Hebrew slave. And when he kind of looks around at the Hebrews and kind of wants them to say, you're one of us, you did that in solidarity with us. Instead, what they say is, what, you're a murderer. What's to keep us from thinking you would turn on us, just like you turned on your adopted Egyptian brother or cousin? And they shun him. And so Moses goes off into exile. He knows he can't go back to the palace because he's just killed an Egyptian soldier. And he's not welcome among the Hebrews because he's just killed an Egyptian soldier, and they don't trust him. So he goes off into the Sinai Peninsula, and he's basically just a wanderer. There's nothing in the story that says that God is leading him or anything like that. He's just wandering away from Egypt, moving away from Egypt. He eventually comes to a little oasis. I think it's called Midian, but I would need to look in the Bible to verify that. But he comes to this little oasis where there are Bedouin nomadic a Bedouin nomadic tribe that kind of wanders back and forth across the Sinai, and they don't know anything about who he is, Hebrew or Egyptian, murderer or defender of a brother. They just welcome him, and he settles in with them and actually marries into the family. He marries one of the daughters of the kind of head patriarch of that clan. And he stays there for many, many years, working for his father-in-law, whose name is Jethro. And he herds sheep he has Jethro, and this is the second time the book of Genesis used this same device about Jacob, but the herds that Moses in charge of thrive way more than any other, and Jethro, his father-in-law, kind of moves him from herd to herd because he's kind of the guarantee of the thriving of all of the individual herds. One day while he's out with the herds, he sees a light of some kind up on what we now know of as Mount Sinai, and he can't figure out the source of the light, and so he struggles to climb the mountain to try to find the source of this light. And when he finally gets close, he sees that there's a bush that's burning and keeps on burning and keeps on burning and never burns out. And he approaches the bush to figure it out a little bit better, and hears a voice, and the voice says, take your sandals off your feet. This is holy ground. And what goes on there at the top of Mount Sinai is that God, the God of Abraham and Sarah, and the descendants all the time, to this day, the God of Abraham and Sarah identifies himself as hearing the groaning of his people in Egypt, and that he has heard enough, and he has now devised a plan to deliver his people from their slavery in Egypt and get them to that promised land that he had promised to Abraham and Sarah. Moses says, that's wonderful. It sounds like a great idea. And then God says, and you're the one who's going to lead this effort. And Moses says, no, I'm no good at that kind of, I'm not good at redeeming people. I'm not good at doing what you're expecting me to do. And God says, I'll make you be what you need to be in order to accomplish my will. And Moses accepts God's call to become the leader of this movement of liberation. He comes down from the mountain, explains to his father-in-law that he's gotten a new job and he needs to go back to Egypt to complete what God has called him to do. He gathers up his family and they go back to Egypt. And understandably, he doesn't go to the palace because he would still be a persona non grata. But he goes to where the Hebrews are living, and he eventually convinces them that he really is speaking on behalf of the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel, that he has the accreditation from God, and God allows him to do certain miracles that convince the Israelites that he's really speaking for Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so they kind of accept him back in into Hebrew society, from which he then begins a series of kind of like shuttle diplomacy between the Hebrews and the Pharaoh. It's not clear if this is the same Pharaoh who was on the throne when Moses went into exile. It's just not clear. But in any case, Moses goes to the Pharaoh and says, "The God of the Israelites has told me that I should tell you to let the Israelites out of your possession and let them go to the land that God had promised them." And the Pharaoh says, "And why am I supposed to do this?" He says, "I've got a bunch of gods here in Egypt who are perfectly okay with our having a bunch of Hebrew slaves doing the work. Your God against our gods. I don't understand why I would do this." And essentially what Moses does is threatens Pharaoh and says, "If you don't do this, there are going to be there's going to be a price to pay." And again, if you read Genesis in just about any translation, you get the dramatic buildup in this in the 10 plagues. Moses says, "If you don't let my people go, all of the blood in Egypt is all of the water in Egypt is going to turn to blood." And that's exactly what happens, except where the Israelites live, they still have fresh water. And when that happens, Pharaoh calls Moses and says, "Okay, I'm convinced. You all can leave and just take this bloody water with you." And Moses does some hocus pocus, and the bloody water goes away. And as soon as Moses is gone, Pharaoh calls him back and says, "No, I changed my mind." And this goes on. It goes through the plague of frogs everywhere in the kingdom, locusts everywhere in the kingdom that ate every shrub. Sounds familiar, except that these guys were really, really bad. They ate everything alive in Egypt. There were the boils on people and on their cattle, pussy boils. There were flies everywhere across Egypt. In every case, the people who lived in Goshen, where the where the Israelites lived, they were spared all of this. It was just the Egyptians and any foreigners who were living with the Egyptians who got these plagues. Over and over again, and it's part of, I think, part of the humor of the way it's written. It's got it. An interesting piece is that after each time that Pharaoh relents and says, "Okay, you can go," and then Exodus says, "But then God hardened Pharaoh's heart again, and he changed his mind." And through this process, the slavery is getting more and more bitter. Anyway, it gets to, there have been 9 of these plagues, and each one Pharaoh has just changed his mind. And God says to Moses, I've got one more, and it's a doozy. As a matter of fact, it's going to be something that you and your descendants forever will remember. Not just those of you who experience it in the next few days, but your whole tribe, nation, people will be, it will be formational to you what I'm about to do. And God gives, through Moses, God gives very detailed instructions to the Israelites for how to prepare a meal. And it's going to be a meal that is not completely communal. It's people in their own households, but if their households are too small, they can combine a couple of households. But the meal is built around a lamb that is sacrificed and then cooked whole. And the blood of that lamb is to be painted on the doorposts of the Israelites or the Hebrews' houses where they live. And the Israelites do this. They have enough time to prepare for this dinner that they actually go to their Egyptian neighbors, and they say, "Can we borrow? This is real festive. Can we borrow some jewelry? Can we borrow some serving dishes? Can we borrow stuff from your house that will make our celebration even better?" And the Egyptians say yes. The Israelites have this big celebratory meal. In their case, it's anticipating their redemption. But that night, the Bible says God sent the angel of death throughout Egypt. And the angel of death went into every household in Egypt and killed the firstborn. But whenever the angel of death came to a house that had the blood on the doorposts, the angel of death would pass over that house and not inflict a death in that house. So that night, all of the Israelites had the blood painted on their doors, and the angel of death passed over all of the Israelites. All of the Egyptians, including the Pharaoh himself, lost his firstborn child. And the Pharaoh heard wailing throughout the streets and finally summoned Moses and said, "We've had enough. Go." He encouraged Egyptians to help the Israelites, to give them food and give them stuff that they would need to get the hell out of there, because that's now what the Pharaoh wanted to be done with these Israelites. So the Israelites, yet that night, while they're eating their meal, they're summoned to start the Exodus, and Moses leads them out of Egypt into the desert outside Egypt. It's essentially the Sinai, what we call the Sinai Peninsula. But before they get there, the Pharaoh changes his mind again, and he summons all of his armies, and sends them to go after the Israelites and recapture them. And one account has the Pharaoh himself at the head of the army chasing the Israelites. The Israelites had a few hours head start, but they don't have chariots, and they've got all the food that they're taking with them. They have children. They have old people. They have the mummy of Joseph that they're carrying with them. And they head out, and they get to what the Bible identifies as the Red Sea. If you look in your maps, you'll see something called the Red Sea now, and that's kind of traditionally ascribed as the one that's referred to in Exodus. But the point is, they get to this body of water and they're trapped. They can't go across the water. Pharaoh and his army are coming up on their rear, and they start complaining to Moses, saying, "So God brought us out here so we should die here by the river? I mean, by the sea?" And Moses has words with God, and God tells Moses to lift his staff, to lift his cane, I guess you would say, his staff over the water, in the direction of the water, and a great wind comes and separates the two sides of the river. Of the sea, so that there's a wall of water on the left and a wall of water on the right, and perfectly dry seabed for the Israelites to cross, which they do. And we're told it's tens of thousands at this point of Hebrews or Israelites, again, including all generations, including some livestock, that kind of stuff. All of them make it across to the other side of the sea. Egypt's army also sees this perfectly dry road in front of them, and they go in after the Israelites. And as soon as the last Israelite makes it to the shore, the wind stops and the water goes back to its regular sea dimensions, and the whole army of the Egyptians is drowned. Now, we should note that there is nowhere in Egyptian history is any kind of catastrophe like that recorded. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It could have been so traumatic that it was, let's edit this from the official record. But in all of the storytelling that the Egyptians have done about their wars and their exploits and so on, there's nothing that relates to this kind of catastrophe. I want to stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions. So the Israelites are now, remember the threefold promise that they would be, to Abraham and Sarah, that they would become a great nation or a great people, that they would have a land of their own that God would give to them, and that through them all people in the world would be blessed. So the Israelites, under Moses' leadership, start crossing the Sinai Peninsula on their way to Canaan, which is the land that God had shown Abraham and his descendants over the years, that this would be the land of their inheritance. But instead of going directly over to Canaan, for reasons that aren't completely clear, God intentionally leads the Israelites on a 40-year journey through the Sinai Peninsula, and they cross over. They cross back. They do figure eights. There's a there's a few suggestions that scholars have come up with for why that happened. One is that nobody. We'll see in a minute. The Israelites are constantly rebellious, and at one point, God says, or at least strongly implies, that because of their rebelliousness, nobody who left Egypt would enter Canaan. That whole generation would die. Now, it was only 40 years, so that the timeline doesn't exactly fit. But it's the other kind of theory is that after their many generations of enslavement in Egypt, they needed time in the wilderness for God to kind of develop them as the people that God wanted them to be. And the highest part of that process was when, through Moses, God gave the teaching, the Torah, to the Israelites. Moses went up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, we believe, again, and Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days, just learning from God these teachings, that he would then come down from the mountain and teach to the Israelites. A couple of interesting things to note in these stories. We noted when Moses first saw the burning bush and received the call from God, that God said, "This is holy land. This is holy land, holy earth, holy ground." When they get to Sinai and Moses is going up and down on a regular basis to commune with God up at the top of the mountain, when he comes down, he's shining. He's shining in such a way that the Israelites can't stand to look at him. And so they ask him, and he agrees to basically wear a cloak over his whole his face and his body when he's down among the people. And then when he goes back up to God, he takes it off, gets another dose of the shine, and comes back down. But all of this is kind of recognition of the holiness of this teaching, and the power of the teaching that God is conveying to the Israelites through Moses. It's many, 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 many laws, regulations, rules, interpretations, but very early gets summarized in what we're familiar with as the Ten Commandments. And the notion that only those 10 teachings were on the stone tablets that that Moses brought down from the mountaintop. That's an artistic conception. It is the notion is that God Himself wrote the Torah, the teachings, on these stones. Later on, Moses and then other teachers, including Jesus, summarized them as the Ten Commandments, but then further summarized them as depending on how you count it, 1 or 2 commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And that's the kind of the 2 tablets of the law, if you will. Is this the first tablet of the law is love God, and then the second tablet of the law is love your neighbor as yourself. And the point of all of this teaching is very, very beautifully summarized when several times in the book of Exodus, and then again in Leviticus, and again in Deuteronomy, when God is talking about giving you've heard this before, what we usually translate as law, but is way better translated as teaching. When God gives the teaching to the Israelites, it is seen as God's gift to the Israelites, and it follows God's redemption of the Israelites. And God says, when He gives the teachings, God says, I, the Lord your God, brought you out of slavery in Egypt and have put you on the road to the land I promised to your ancestors. Now, therefore, do this, don't do that. Live this way. Live in a way that shows that you understand the gift of redemption that you have received from me, and that you have a special calling to embody for the world the way of being in the world that is God-pleasing and justice oriented, mercy and justice oriented. And again, for our Jewish neighbors, they understand the Torah as that blessing that had been promised as long ago as Abraham and Sarah, that all the people of the world would be blessed. And they understand this Torah as being that blessing. We understand the Torah, we as Christians understand the Torah as a powerful expression of God's will for God's people, the people whom God has redeemed. But we understand that it is Jesus that is the fulfillment of that promise that all people would be blessed through the descendants of Abraham and Sarah. And it's not that we disparage the Torah or the law. In fact, Jesus constantly referred to the teachings of Moses, the scriptures, and but he also, and this is very important. We saw this in the gospel lesson a couple of weeks ago. He saw the rules of the Torah, the teaching, as not being set in stone. Remember, he's criticized a couple of weeks ago in the gospel lesson. He's criticized for healing a guy with a withered hand on the Sabbath because you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath. And Jesus says that's just stupid. That's a stupid understanding of that kind of commandment. You're putting the letter of the law over the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law, love your neighbor as yourself. How can I, if I have the power to heal this man, how can I not do it? Isn't that a sacred moment when that happens, a Sabbath moment when that happens? So he's both a very, very strong teacher of the law and proponent of the law, or the Torah, correctly understood as being God's invitation to us for how to live in the world, rather than some kind of here's a set of rules that if you don't keep them, you're not going to make it in my realm, in my reign. And that's kind of the different. You sometimes hear people talk about someone who's law oriented or gospel oriented, and it's kind of, is your default setting to say, but a rule was broken, or is your default setting to say, was the rule broken for a good reason, for a neighbor loving reason? And which is more important, not breaking the rule or helping the neighbor? And that's kind of the tension that Jesus brings to this understanding of the place of the law, or the Torah, in the ongoing life of the people of God. I'm going to stop there a minute. Mike, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Has this been a long-standing, uh, call it debate between the law versus the teaching, or is this relatively new that the law is or is teaching versus the law?
Um, I I think, at least in its roots, it goes back at least to Martin Luther, who kind of what is the he's credited with kind of recapturing for the church the centrality of the gospel, that it's not about rules and regulations, things that you do, things that you didn't do, merits and demerits. It's not about kind of the idea that your challenge is, when you die, to have your gauge on the goods, on the saint side rather than on the sinner side. Um, Luther picked up from Paul that we're always both, and there's no way that we can saint ourselves into God's, where God has to then bring us into heaven because we're so darn good. Um, but what Luther taught, and what we continue to teach, is that God's grace is so overwhelming, and it is the beginning point for our understanding of our relationship to God. It's not that we are striving to earn God's grace. It's that we start out beloved by God. And the challenge for us is to live up to our identity as the children of God that God says that we are. Does that make sense?
It does. So, and there are some Christian faiths that take a stronger position, in the area of law, right? Even the
Yes,
Catholics, they're much more into the rules, and I think some
right,
other faiths, um, Jehovah's Witnesses, that's others that are, really live by the word very rigidly.
right.
That it makes sense that Martin Luther might have been the one that kind of uh, changed that a little bit, made it a little
Hmm.
bit more reasonable.
Yeah, because he recentered the church in grace. That grace is the starting point of the church, not sin and your shortcomings.
Hmm.
I'm going to tell you how unworthy you are, so that you can do some stuff to make you less unworthy.
Right.
And we say, you just can't do that.
Yeah.
We're sinful. And Paul would say sin, and Luther would echo, sinful through and through. And also child of God through and through. What we have, um, particularly Lutherans, been able to do successfully for many generations is keep things in tension. So it's not law or gospel. God speaks to us in law and gospel. We we happen to believe that gospel is the I don't want to push this language too far, but it's gospel is like the natural language for God, the default language for God. And law is the, when that doesn't work, then I'm going to um, push the law part. But what Luther teaches is that the law is not intended to show us a way to atone for ourselves.
Hmm.
The law is intended, among other things, the law is intended to convince us that we are unworthy on our own and that we need redemption from the outside. We need, we conclude that we need redemption through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that, again, that the law helps move us in the direction of understanding that what we need is God's grace, which is most fully, not exclusively, but most fully expressed in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Other questions, comments? Um, just we've got just a couple minutes left. I'm going to do a real fast forward. Um, the Israelites spend these 40 years in the Sinai Peninsula. They complain against God constantly. Um, they say they're starving to death. God sends them partridges to uh, eat to their heart's delight, and then they start saying, we're so sick of partridges. Mm-hmm. And that's just kind of the ongoing or the secular story that goes on in the Sinai Peninsula. Eventually, they get to they actually bypass Canaan. They go east of Canaan, um, because there's a stronger city state right on the border of Sinai, basically where Gaza is now. And uh, uh, they decide to not to go directly that way, but to bypass. Meanwhile, um, Moses dies. God calls him up onto a mountain. At one point during these 40 years of traveling, Moses made God mad, and I can't remember the specifics of it, but he disobeyed God, and God said, Moses, I've had it. I'm not going to let you go into the promised land. And so the basically the story of Moses closes with Moses going up on a mountain. Traditionally, this is Mount Hermon, and it's east of in what now is Syria. And from there, he looks back to the west, and he sees the land that was promised to Abraham and Sarah, and that has now been called the Promised Land that the Israelites are on their way to. And Moses gets to see across the Jordan River to the land that the people are going to go to, but he doesn't get to go there. There's a rather tender story about Moses looking out and then breathing his last and God burying him. I just think that's a wonderful touch in the story, that God himself buries him, and no one to this day knows, and this is how the story ends, no one to this day knows exactly where
Where?
where Moses was buried. Um, so then Moses' lieutenant Joshua takes over leadership, and he becomes uh, the military genius that leads the Israelites into the conquest of Canaan, and it goes on over a few generations. There is um, there is very little evidence in today's Israel and Palestine of any kind of conquest at the time that we're talking about. What there is evidence of is foreign influence becoming dominant, in an outside influence coming into various tribes and kingdoms and city states, and becoming prominent. And it's kind of, the idea is that the Israelites took over Canaan not by conquest, but by just they had larger numbers. They settled in lands that they made deals, and eventually they controlled most of Canaan. Again, it takes several hundred years for this to happen. And during that time, there's just a series of what are called judges that are just charismatic military leaders that rise up when there's a particular threat from the Philistines or the Moabites or various surrounding people. When there's a threat, God raises up a charismatic leader to lead the military expedition to conquer those foes, and then that person just blends back into the population. It's not like that person is a lifetime general or a king or anything like that. And that's again, that goes on for 250 years or so, where the Israelites are just their um, building their power and their nation where the Canaanites used to be. We're going to stop there. We're a few minutes over our time. Any questions before we quit?
Nothing further.
Next week we're going to be looking at David and Solomon. That's the epitome of the Israelite kingdom. When they uh, evolve from a loose confederation of tribes into a well-structured, well-heeled, and temporarily powerful little empire in the ancient Mideast. So David and Solomon next time. Thanks, everybody.
Very good.
Thank
Thank you.
you.